So, welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. My name is Chris Monsieur. I'm a faculty member in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and together with Professor Liu, co-host the winter seminar. Just an announcement for the students that are in the class here and the ones watching over the web. Hopefully you've signed in by now. The assignments will be due Tuesday, 5 p.m. And both Professor and Liu and I have set up drop boxes on D2L. So upload a PDF of either your reflective journal or your paper to the D2L site Tuesday, 5 p.m. So, and I passed around the sign-in sheet for today. So make sure you sign in because it'll be the last time that you can sign in for and make sure everything looks correct on your attendance log. So, all right. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's speaker. So today's speaker is Andrée Tremoulet. She's a research associate at the Center for Urban Studies at Portland State. After her career as a local practitioner in planning, housing, and community development, she returned to PSU and earned her doctorate in urban studies. So she's going to talk to us today about homeless encampments on public right-of-way. Very interesting topic. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Andrée.
Thank you. Well, good to see you all on a Friday, probably the last class of the session. I taught my last class on a Thursday yesterday, so I know how all of you must feel. Hopefully this will be an interesting topic, maybe a little bit different than some of the other ones that you've dealt with today. You know, homelessness is a widespread societal problem, and as this particular slide poses, is it really a transportation issue? Well, let's think about that for a minute. So in 2011, there's a point-in-time count where a lot of social service agencies all over the United States count the number of homeless people in a particular night. It's a point-in-time count. And report that information to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And in 2011, there were over 244,000 people who were unsheltered in the United States. Unsheltered means they couldn't even get into a shelter. The only option for them was sleeping in a car, sleeping under a bridge, sleeping in the nooks and crannies of different buildings. And so this problem of homelessness, even though it's not primarily a transportation issue, it reaches out and it touches many different sectors. It touches the business sector. It also touches transportation in that it can pose a maintenance problem for people who are responsible for maintaining our streets and roads and bridges and so forth. One of the things that my co-researchers, Ellen Bassett, who is a former professor here at Portland State, who now has gone on to the University of Virginia, and Allison Moe, who is a MERP who graduated, so yes, it does happen. Graduation does happen. One of the things that we found was that there was very little research on this topic about homelessness on DOT rights of way. And the little bit of research that it was really didn't talk about it in a very holistic way. It talked mostly about kind of debris and trimming landscaping and things like that. It didn't really deal with the human element. And so I'm really a housing person by trade. I'm not really a part of your tribe. I'm actually part of the housing tribe. But, you know, there's something to be gained by looking, I think, holistically at this issue. So one of the first things that we tried to do was to get a handle on, was this a widespread challenge or issue or not? So we looked at two sources of data. One of the things Allison did is that she did a LexisNexis research of looking for the keywords of homeless encampment or homeless camp or tent city occurring along with the word Department of Transportation in news articles. And since 2009, there were over 100 news articles that she identified mentioning homeless camps and DOTs. And they represented incidents in 20 states, as you can see shown by the green on this map. The other thing we did is we did a convenience sample of people who do maintenance work, mostly managers or supervisors in the United States. And the way we got that survey out is we had a contact with a research director. He distributed it to other research directors all over the United States and at least one Canadian province. And then they distributed it, hopefully, some of them did anyway, to people in their own states who they thought could be appropriate people to respond to the question of whether or not homelessness, or homeless encampments in particular, is a transportation issue. Well, we heard from 24 states, and sometimes we heard from multiple people from some states, but 76% of those 24 states that responded said that they considered problems with homeless encampments as an operational challenge. And you can see those states shown by the gold dot there. So let's step back for a second and talk a little bit about homelessness. Homelessness, first of all, homelessness is a condition that someone experiences. It doesn't define who that program is, or who that person is. For the vast majority of people who experience homelessness, it's a transitional situation. As a matter of fact, the estimate is 5 out of every 6 individuals nationally who experience homelessness were transitionally homeless, meaning that their life had hit a bump in the road. Sometimes it's a divorce, sometimes it's domestic violence, sometimes it's overwhelming medical bills that force people to make some difficult choices. Sometimes it's the loss of a job. Sometimes it can be a recurring mental health problem. It can be any number of things that moves people from a place of stability to a place of instability and on the street. Some people live at the edge. I mean, some people have minimum wage jobs or jobs that aren't long-term. And so it really doesn't take very much. They're one paycheck away from being on the street. And unfortunately, this affects not just adults and individuals, but it also affects children. Only 17% of the people who are homeless are what we would consider to be chronically homeless. Chronically homeless people are defined by HUD as having a disabling condition, mental or physical, and either being continuously homeless for at least a year or experiencing 4 episodes of homelessness in 3 years. So another way to think about it is that people who are chronically homeless, many of them, they're part of a culture of homelessness. I mean, they are a part of almost a separate way of being. People who are, and I'm simplifying this, I mean, and people don't fall into categories neatly, and so I'm giving you some gross generalizations here. People who are transitionally homeless often try to pass. They often are ashamed of being homeless. They often try to hide their condition. And many people who you pass on the street may well be transitionally homeless, but you may not be able to identify them as being such. And that is, in fact, the majority of people who are homeless. But all those people sometimes end up seeking refuge in these nooks and crannies. So let's just talk about putting the pieces together here. So for transportation agencies, homeless encampments pose maintenance and safety problems. But it's a different kind of maintenance problem. And let me tell you about some of the kinds of maintenance problems we've heard. There's obviously sometimes trash and litter problems. One of the most common issues we heard was safety issues. There's safety concerns for pedestrians, there's safety concerns for motorists, there's safety concerns for DOT personnel, and there's safety concerns for the homeless folks themselves. Sometimes there are hazardous wastes. There can be waste caused by humans and dogs. There can be needles, there can be sharps, depending on what the situation is. Sometimes a hazmat contractor has to come in and clean up the site that people were living in. And sometimes there's a damage issue. Sometimes there's actually an issue of chasing off legitimate uses that are being more or less displaced by the homeless folks who were there. So sometimes there are these maintenance issues, but it's a human problem. It's not just a maintenance problem that you deal with maintenance equipment. That's part of it, but it's more than that. So for transportation agencies, sometimes this requires entering a different kind of problem-solving territory. But on the other hand, these agencies are not social service or housing agencies. No one expects people whose job it is to deal with transportation to be human services personnel and to have that skill set. That's not reasonable. So the question is, to us, that we were asking, given the fact that there's no research, what do good solutions look like in the field, and what can we learn from them? So we had two primary research questions. What are the nature and extent of problems caused by homeless encampments on public right-of-way in the United States? And the second is, what practices do transportation agencies currently use to address these problems, and what are the outcomes? And in particular, we were looking for best practices. So here's a little bit of an overview of our project. ODOT asks us to take a very close look at a single case study that I'm going to talk about in a little bit of detail. It's the Baldock case study. How many of you know where the Baldock Rest Area is? So the Baldock Rest Area is on I-5. It's south of Wilsonville. It's the first rest area that you hit going south on I-5 from Portland. And it's on both sides of the street, and it's not 100 acres, but it's 80-some-odd acres. It's a very large site. And there was a homeless encampment there that I'm going to talk about in a second. So we did a single case study of that. And then the other thing that we did, which I mentioned already, is we did this online survey of DOT staff and rest area managers. And then for people, we asked people if they'd be willing to talk with us. And for the people who said they would be willing to talk with us, we did follow-up interviews to get kind of a more nuanced sense of what was going on. And we also did media research and literature reviews. So first, I'm going to talk about the Baldock case study. So this is really, first of all, here's a map of the Baldock Rest Area right here along I-5. You can see one of the things to notice is that there are all these these are all parking areas. So you notice that there's sort of a front parking area and there's a back parking area. The front parking area tends to be used by visitors. The folks who are in the back, well, the back parking area is where the long-term homeless folks tended to live on both sides. Meanwhile, if you were just a visitor, you could run in and out and not really understand or know that the rest of it was there. So this site was really quite ideal if you're a homeless person. And you have a car, which many homeless people don't have. This is sort of the higher echelon of homeless. When you have a car, you can have more possessions. You can have more of your life around you. If you don't have a car, you have less possessions, fewer possessions, and so you're kind of lower in the hierarchy of homeless folks. So, but this is quite ideal because if you have a vehicle, you can get to Portland and social service agencies. There are restrooms with hot and cold running water. And there's a truck stop down on I-5 where you can pay for hot showers and get food and stuff like that. So it's a pretty ideal area, and it's quite lovely. There are trees. It's quite a nice place to camp. So there was a long-standing community of homeless people. One night, they counted there were 109 people living in the Baldock Rest Area in winter. And it greatly expanded in the summer when the snowbirds came up, that's right, I guess. Anyway, people came from California and moved back up to Oregon. And there were two principal kinds of folks. There were the chronically homeless, and then there were people that the social service agency called the shadow people, which are the transitional homeless folks. And they would mostly, the chronically homeless people would more or less stay there all the time. They'd set up tents or they'd be in their cars. But the transitionally homeless people would just go there to sleep at night. And there's some amazing stories. There was one woman who, I believe she was the person who had the master's degree, who was staying there, and she was recovering. She had cancer, and so she'd have chemotherapy, and she had lost her house, a place to live. She'd lost her home due to medical bills, so she'd have chemotherapy, and then she would go to the rest area and recover in her car, because that's the only place she had to live. So there's some pretty tragic stories of people who live there. This was such a well-known thing that the school bus would stop there and pick up kids. And St. Vincent de Paul, the food bus would stop there once a week make regular stops. So ODOT doesn't have a lot of resources for maintenance. And every now and then what would happen would be they would get some complaints or something would happen, and they call the state police to more or less clear the area. The state police would do a sweep, and people would go away, and then they'd come back, right? And so that cycle had been happening over many years. So what happened as a result of legislative action was the Oregon Transportation Information Council, now called Oregon Travel Experience. They're the folks that maintain the signage on state highways and decide who can have signage, and they do other things as well. They took over maintenance of the rest areas, and they convened local groups in the surrounding area to basically develop visions of what the rest area could be. Well, they were going to have an issue because the folks who, the business people, having a homeless encampment there wasn't consistent with the vision for what the rest area might eventually become. But on the other hand, they didn't want to just kick the folks out. And so what they did was, rather than try to solve the problem themselves, they convened a bunch of people and said, here's the problem. We don't know how to solve it. What can we do? So what we found at the heart of the project is collaboration among agency partners who had not successfully collaborated previously. And in some cases, they actually looked on the others with some distrust. So it included the DA, the district attorney. It included the state police. It also included the county's homeless agency. It included a representative from the state homeless agency. It included housing folks. So it included people both from the social services side and from the law enforcement and criminal justice side, as well as the Department of Transportation, which still owned this asset, to basically say, what can we do here? And so one of the things that they found was that they had different goals, but they had complementary goals. So the housing people were primarily concerned about, is this really a good place, a good way to live? Can we do better for these folks? The folks with the Oregon Travel Information Council and the business people wanted to restore the rest area for its primary use, which was for visitors. And the law enforcement really wanted to eliminate the encampment and its problems. And there was an overlap among the three of these. The other kind of piece of the backstory was the Canby Center had, which is a social service, faith-based social service agency, had a long-standing pre-relationship, went back for about a year or more, with people who lived at the rest area. And they knew them by name, and they knew their stories. And they didn't treat them as people who needed handouts. They treated them as people who were human beings, and they would get them to volunteer. And so it was a more robust relationship than what you ordinarily find, and it was based on respect, mutual respect on both sides. Because remember, if you're chronically homeless and you've been pushed around by law enforcement, you're not going to trust law enforcement, and you're not going to always trust social service agencies. But these folks, they had managed to get through and build up this sense of trust. So the strategy that emerged was what we've come to call a push-pull strategy. And it really gelled at a criminal justice seminar that the district attorney happened to convene, and there were people from both sides, the criminal justice side and the social services side, looking at each other with some distrust, but saying, maybe we can work on this together. So the pull side, in terms of encouraging people to move, was housing and services provided in a case management type of manner, very individualized manner. It looks at removing the barriers that are preventing people from moving into housing and unpeeling the layers of the onion. The push side came from essentially law enforcement, the ODOT, and the criminal justice system. So there were new rules that were put in place there, and also a new level of enforcement. So the rules became a higher class of misdemeanor that was more enforceable than what it had been before. Interestingly, they didn't have to use the enforcement tool. They just need to use the threat of it. So people did move. Moving day was May 1st, and every day everyone did move from the rest area. And there was a rule that you can stay there 12 hours at a time. So some people did in and out for a while. In other words, they'd be there for a while, and then they'd leave. You have truck drivers who use it as places to sleep. Why can't people who need a place to sleep for other reasons also be there for 12 hours, as long as they don't set up tents and do everything else? So it is still being used to some degree to that way, in a legal way, but again, it's become a safer place all around. In terms of the outcomes, about 50% of the people who accepted case management, and there were about 30 households who did, about 18 months later were in permanent housing. That's incredible. It wasn't that all of a sudden the doors opened and there was new housing for these people. They were helped to access the existing systems that were there. The only thing that was different for them than anybody else was this case management. They had someone working with them to help them access the system. Let's see, a smaller percentage, a little bit less than a quarter, were in transitional housing, which means that they were waiting for permanent housing, and then about a third were unstable. That's a pretty good result for people who had been chronically homeless before. The other thing that was measured in terms of outcomes was Fred Testa, who was with the state police, looked at calls for service related to the Baldock Rest Area in a period of time in 2009, before this whole thing happened, and then looked at it afterwards in 2010, and you can see that the calls for service decreased dramatically. So it was a pretty good outcome. So this strategy, by and large, is called humane displacement. okay? And we're going to be talking about 3 strategies, and this is one of them. So in terms of lessons learned, the real solution started to happen when someone asked, whose problem is this, right? It's not just a transportation problem. Heavens no. I mean, you know, it's not your job to deal with this. On the other hand, it's not just a housing problem, and it's not just a police problem. It's a societal problem. And each little segment had something to contribute to it. The other thing was this notion of a 2-pronged strategy through multi-agency collaboration. It doesn't mean that everyone believes the same thing. It means that you have goals that are complementary, that don't conflict with each other, and you can figure out a way to work together. Where there had been little trust among team members before, they really developed a sense of trust, and people went out on the limb. Some of the people who were involved in this, they developed, some of the social services people went out on a limb for the people who were in law enforcement and vice versa, in terms of the supervisors and stuff, and say, look, we can manage this. They're going to give us some flexibility here. It'll be okay. But it was because the team had so solidified that they were able to step out of the particular hat that they were wearing and be part of this team. In terms of the homeless folks, you know, they didn't treat them like a herd of cattle. They were individuals who had individual stories that needed to be taken apart and dissected and helped on an individual basis. That was the social services side of things. That was not the transportation agency side of things. But the transportation agency and the other agencies could show respect for the fact that these folks were human beings with complicated stories. The other thing is that it was very intense and very impactful on the people who were involved. I mean, they were involved all times of day and night, establishing relationships with these folks, and they had to do things in ways that they hadn't done before. So that was a very intense story. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we learned from the national best practices that we did. As I've already mentioned, there were a variety of problems, and this is the survey of transportation agencies. Safety, property damage, environmental contamination, displacement of intended uses. Also, you know, this can be a political nightmare for some transportation agencies. You want to get a transportation agency riled, get an elected official riled who then calls someone at the top of the transportation agency, and it goes all the way down, and then it's in the media. You know, I mean, so there are PR issues associated with this. Both ways. Both, how can you know, why isn't the transportation agency getting these terrible people off the land? Or why is this transportation agency, you know, kicking out these poor victims? I mean, so they get hit from both sides. So it can be a real public relations nightmare. 91% of the people we interviewed, or the people who responded, said that they encountered camps a few times a year or more. And 48%, about half, said that they encountered encampments a few times per month or more. In terms of the people we heard from, all of them who encountered the camps called law enforcement, and 83% said it was usually or sometimes effective. We didn't ask for how long, but maybe it was immediately effective. 67% said they work with social services, and 66% of those said that it was usually or sometimes effective. One of the really interesting things is that only 4% had said that they had ever received any type of training to deal with this problem. And 63% thought that training would be useful. Again, it's not becoming an expert on homelessness, but it's beginning to understand the problem and even understanding who's working on the problem in the area. So when we decided to do a best practices guide, we looked at a couple of things. We thought that there were three main pieces that people needed. The first was, you've got a problem right there. You have an encampment. What do you do? All right? So how to respond to a particular incident. The second thing was, you know, maybe if we can get to some state transportation directors, DOT directors, maybe if they see that this is a repeated problem and it's costing them money to deal with it on a repeated basis, or it's costing them political capital in the news media or politically, you know, maybe there should be some sort of policy framework around it so that people don't feel like they're out on their own trying to fix this. And then the other thing is that, I mean, we were able to dig down and find some specialized resources that relate to this topic that we actually put in a bibliography. And this is available online, but we tried to make it very user-friendly in terms of a document, so it's not very researchy. It has a lot of color and pictures and bubble diagrams and so forth, but I just thought I'd pass that around. It's available on the OTREC website. So I'm going to talk really about the first, let me just go back. I'm really going to primarily talk about this. We don't have time to talk about these other two pieces, but you can, if you're interested, you can see it in the book. So, you know, one of the things that probably civil engineers and planners think about are life cycle costs, right? In other words, if you're going to build something, what is the overall cost of building it and maintaining it over the lifetime, you know, for one solution versus another solution versus another? Well, here's a social version of a similar idea. So what we have here is we've got a cycle, right? Homeless people set up a camp is observed, DOT calls law enforcement, police evict the homeless people, they look for a site, they set up a camp, right? We end up going in the same circle. That is not a very cost-effective solution because the problem keeps coming back. So if you're thinking about life cycle costs, calling the cops and doing nothing else is not necessarily a very cost-effective solution. So what we ended up doing is we ended up coming up with this process of, well, how can we get around that cycle? So we broke it down into three, or really four stages. The first is, what kind of problem do you have here? Is it something that is life-threatening or not, and how do you respond? The second is, if you've got the time, you know, can you actually convene a group to work on it? The other, another kind of little thing that gets inserted there is really understanding the problem. First of all, what's the physical condition that made this particular site attractive to homeless people? It might be, I mean, I talked about some of those things with the Baldock Rest Area, but there are other things that make a site attractive. And sometimes it's things on the DOT site, and sometimes it's what it's near, you know? And then the last step is choosing your strategy. So the first step is to assess the urgency of the response. So there are two common situations, and I'm oversimplifying here, but acute public endangerment is, you know, you've got something that's really scary. You need to shut it down right away because someone's going to get hurt or someone's going to get killed. The other problem is a simmering nuisance, which means that's a little bit more like the Baldock, right? You could take a little bit of time. Heck, it had been there for 18 years. I didn't tell you, there was someone there who was known as the mayor of Baldock. He had been there for 18 years. So that was definitely a long simmering nuisance. If you have a simmering nuisance, then you can identify collaborators. And we think about, essentially, you've got internal partners. Sometimes you need your PR person. Sometimes you need maintenance people. Sometimes you need finance people. Sometimes you need landscaping people. Sometimes you need hazmat people. I don't know what you need. But, I mean, think about the people you need internally. But then think about law enforcement, district attorneys, legal advocates for the homeless. The legal advocates for the homeless are really important to involve because they will push back on these folks and they will make sure that the solution that you come up with will stand up in court. So in other words, vet it, bring everyone under the tent, including the opposition, rather when you roll it out so that you have something everyone can agree to. And then the pull are like the social service providers, the social service agencies, people like that. So we came up with, and this is very much of a simplification, and people will borrow and combine different strategies, but the first one is humane displacement, and it should be humane, not human, to assist people living at the site with finding better living options and restore the site to the original use. That was the Baldock Rest Area. The second one is short-term accommodation. So maybe you don't have to move right away. So to contain or reduce the wear and tear on the existing site in the short term and help the group locate a more permanent solution within a set time frame. So give people a little while to come up with something. And then the third is, and I don't know if this is happening on transportation land yet, but I'm really glad that there are some engineers and planners here who will be out in the field in the future for you to think about this. Long-term arrangement. To accommodate the long-term habitation of homeless individuals or a homeless community on a designated site and reduce the risk of negative impacts on the site that result from a homeless encampment. So an example of humane displacement besides the Baldock was one in Massachusetts. They had a encampment that was in a very dangerous area near a shopping mall. And what they had done in 2009 was that they had called the cops and then cleaned up the site. And they had done that twice, and it was very expensive. And then when it happened again in 2010, they said, you know, maybe we should do something different here. So what they did is they contacted a homeless shelter that was known for partnering with folks like transportation agencies. The homeless folks went out and said, you know, and talked to the people who were on the site and said, the DOT is going to crack down in about a week. So we can offer you some options. Here are what your options are. So they did some outreach. There were some people who didn't want to move, and so they did do a sweep, and there were a few arrests in that particular example. But again, I mean, and then what they did is they looked at the site, they did the hazmat and so forth cleanup, and then they altered the site through landscaping and trimming trees and other means so that it was less of a likely site for people to be at. And so they essentially reestablished it as part of the transportation infrastructure. It was right near a highway, and it just was not a safe place for people to be. A short-term accommodation, an example of that, interestingly, is, how many of you are familiar with Dignity Village? Okay, so Dignity Village is a self-managed homeless encampment that actually has currently a lease with the city. It is self-managed, no social service agency. They're incorporated. They have an agreement with the city of Portland, and they're out by the airport on a leaf composting facility. They have semi-permanent to more permanent structures. I think they have a 10-year lease now on the land, and they have rules that people who are there live by. And it's quite a place. This picture is actually from Eugene, this Conestoga wagon type of thing, but it's a similar idea. But this started out as short-term accommodation because they were originally on DOT land right down by near the river. And the DOT let them stay there. The Oregon DOT let them stay there for a while they negotiated with the city and eventually came up with another site. And matter of fact, I think they were there for several months. I mean, so the DOT did a good job of, you know, that's an example of a short-term accommodation and a very well-organized group of people. There's a lot of turnover in that camp. which there should be because people move on from being homeless into a more permanent situation. A long-term arrangement is something that was reached in the city outside of, it was in the state of Washington, outside of the Seattle area. And it started with people who were on land owned by a church. And originally the city said, I'm sorry, those people can't be there, but then the church sued successfully under RILUA, which is an act that has to do with the use of land by religious institutions. And essentially, they were able to have the homeless encampment. It now rotates from place to place every 90 days from different churches to different churches. You can see the church sign right there. But the homeless encampment moves, but it's more or less a permanent group. And there's a separate social service agency that manages it and enforces rules. So here's an example of an arrangement that is facilitated by a social service agency instead of being self-managed. So, you know, again, putting together the pieces here. The first step is to assess the urgency of the response. The second is to identify the partners. The third is to do the analysis. What events and conditions preceded and accompanied the problem? That's really the question to ask to get you to understand why this place, why now. Then there's a range of options to consider. Then when you're done, you can assess the problem. So in terms of assessment, it doesn't have to be all that sophisticated. I mean, you saw what we had, the social service agencies, in our case, were able really to track what happened to the individuals. It was a very simple matter of going through the records and looking at police calls. The other kind of assessment that you can do is within your own agency in terms of, is there some institutional learning going on here? Do your managers feel more confident that they're going to be able to deal with a situation like this if it crops up in the future? Do they know partners? A variety of different things like that. The thing that I'm not going to have time to talk about today is this notion of creating a policy framework, and that's really the third chapter of our guide. But we've laid out a process that involves getting a sense of how big the problem is in your state. And by the way, I think doing this kind of scan for an agency would be a dynamite job for a group of planners and doing a workshop project. I think it would be really interesting, or maybe some other kind of project, to do a scan of how big of a problem is this in terms of a planning and management issue for transportation agencies. Form a committee that involves all these disparate partners. As a transportation agency, you're in command of that committee. You analyze kind of what you've learned from the scan. Where are the issues? Why are they occurring there? What are some, and then you start to talk about, well, what are some alternatives? Well, you know what? If you've put this committee together, now it's not just transportation people talking to transportation people. You've got a more holistic approach. You can talk about the human element. You can talk about human solutions as well as talking about solutions that have to do with maintenance issues. You develop responses, and it might not be a cookie-cutter response. It might be, we really want to empower people to be able to problem solve at the local level because every problem is different, and here are a set of tools that we're going to put in place that's going to allow that problem solving to occur. And furthermore, we're going to create a reward system inside our agency that's going to support problem solving. And then after you do that, you put in place some sort of assessment process. So I want to conclude with a thought that is actually not my thought. This picture is what you often see under bridges, right? It's a makeshift shelter where someone has a sleeping bag and a few possessions and a water bottle and a little bit of food and so forth and so on, and looks like there's another person sleeping there. But, you know, we presented a poster about our work at the TRB conference in January, and a regional director for the Federal Highway Administration looked at our display and said, you know what, this problem isn't going to go away anytime soon. What if we started collaborating with others concerned about this issue and leveraged our transportation infrastructure in a way to help alleviate the suffering and make things better for all concerned? What if we started to design transportation elements like bridges to accommodate this reality? What might that look like? Wouldn't look like this. So anyway, I wanted to leave that thought with, and of course, I mean, there's the management side of it also. There's the human side. There's, you need to partner with social service agencies. How might that work? But the idea of accommodating rather than just simply repelling, using an asset cross-sectorally to solve a very complex human problem. So in conclusion, what I'm hoping that this has encouraged you to think about is maybe the need to shift paradigms from an internally focused, somewhat hierarchical model of management to solving a problem. I mean, the usual way of transportation agencies, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, is you want to reduce risk, right? You want to reduce or eliminate risk. Well, it's pretty risky to all of a sudden say, well, you know what, I'm going to involve some more partners with this, and I'm going to give up a little control. And that's not something that comes naturally or easily in that way of doing and thinking. But sometimes you can come up with a better solution if you do that. And that's why this whole notion of collaborating really matters. So here's where you can find our guides on the OTREC website, and I think we're Project 477. Thank you.
All right, so we have we have time for questions, and we have to use the mic over the web. So.
Thanks. So in thinking about some of these short-term and long-term solutions, and then also thinking about the statistics that you presented about the different types of homeless people, how 17% are chronically homeless and the rest are in transition, I guess I was just curious if, so when you're thinking about these solutions, are you gearing them towards people who are in transition versus people who are likely to maybe remain homeless for a long time? How do you involve them in that decision-making process? And are there sort of different types of solutions for people who, are temporarily homeless and are really trying to not be homeless versus people who would like to, possibly like to remain homeless?
They're very different solutions. They're as different as the range of people who are homeless. So in the social service world, typically people who are transitionally homeless just need help getting on their feet. They have life skills. They are often employable. They've hit a bump in the road. And it's more kind of connecting with those social services or jobs or family or, well, actually the model now is housing first, finding housing so your life can be stabilized, and then adding on all the other services around it. But they're not going to need the kind of depth of social services that folks who are chronically homeless are. And some people who are chronically homeless, they really have a different lifestyle, and that's what they want to embrace. Other people really are ready for change. They want to address a substance abuse issue. They want to deal with mental health issues. They see some possibility for themselves there. Other people want to always live at the margins. One of the things that is really interesting is that a long time ago, a lot of the hotels in downtowns, the older downtown hotels, served as residential hotels where older, homeless, mostly men lived. And those folks, a lot of the folks who lived there, just were not particularly capable of a normal lifestyle. And so, but they had shelter. The thing that's happened is a lot of those low-cost options that allowed people to have shelter that they paid for or whatever are gone now. So they end up homeless. So again, to answer your question, typically there are the solutions for people who just need help getting a job or help with their finances. Those are problems that can be solved pretty easily to get people on their feet. The kinds of solutions that involve folks that are chronically homeless, they're more long-term and often involve, I would say, deeper kinds of therapy and a whole range of services.
Throughout the Portland area, you can see under some freeway bridges areas that have been fenced off. And I was wondering if you could talk about that kind of action in this context, if that was just kind of a Band-Aid or if it's an organized idea to approach it that way. Or
well, I can only speak about my own personal opinion of that. I'm sure for the folks who do maintenance, the notion of putting up a fence is a pretty effective solution because now they don't have to go and clean the site again. But from the point of view of a motorist, is a fence really a lovely thing to look at? Is a chain link fence really a good solution? From the point of view of someone who is homeless, certainly isn't a very good solution. I'd like to think that there were better answers than that. And again, I mean, that's kind of why I issued the challenge at the end. Maybe the designers here maybe there's a better way of thinking about it. Maybe some places should be designed so that people can't access them because they really are dangerous, right? And other places, maybe there ought to be a way of thinking about maybe there's a way of partnering with some agencies or something to make some places a little bit more workable. So a site to look up that's pretty interesting, it's in Texas, I think. It's called Church Under the Bridge. And essentially there was a whole ministry associated with ministering. Well, Texas is a place where faith-based social services are really big. It's part of the South, so that's one of the things that happens. And so there's this whole network of social service stuff and faith-based stuff that goes on under this bridge. And it's really kind of been turned into a place where there aren't fences.
So I am a little bit familiar with Dignity Village and think that's a really interesting model. And I was curious whether when you were doing surveys to other state DOTs to ask about whether encampments were a problem, whether you encountered if anyone else has sort of is doing that anywhere else, that they've sort of set aside land that might be state-owned or city-owned to do sort of a self-regulated sort of encampment. And secondly, whether if you guys are sharing sort of that model with anyone else in your best practices as you were doing research.
So in terms of the Dignity Village, we did not ask that question directly, but when we did the follow-up interviews, we encountered, the trick with Dignity Village was that there were a group of people who were self-organized and had the ability to pull it together themselves. That's not the case. I mean, they considered themselves a community. And that's not always the case with people individually who are homeless. Sometimes they avoid each other rather than form a community. In the Baldock, they were definitely a community. The mayor, they had rules and all this other stuff. But to get back to your question, we didn't specifically ask about that, but there was one other state that really didn't want their story shared, so we weren't able to include it, but that had a similar thing. And by doing other research, I was able to find, I guess it was done by a VISTA volunteer or an AmeriCorps volunteer back probably, I guess it's maybe about 5 or 6 years old, but it was essentially a list of places of encampments that were self-managed like that. So and I don't know how many of them are still going on. One of the things that you'll notice, to answer your third question, one of the things that we did was in our appendix, we put resources in there both for transportation agencies. It's essentially what a lease might look like if you want to lease your land to an entity of some kind. That's one of the things that we included in there in the hope of stimulating some thinking along those lines. And then the other thing that we did is we also have an appendix which includes rules that various camps have developed for their own self-management, or in some cases it's rules that were developed by a social service agency that is essentially managing a group of people. And they really vary. For example, in Dignity Village, they don't allow any kids there because they have people there who kids shouldn't be around, who have a criminal history of child abuse. And so they don't feel like they can assure the safety of kids. But they also have no drinking, no disturbances. I mean, they have other rules. So, I mean, they're very thoughtful about what they allow and don't allow. Other places, other homeless places, kids are fine because there are things in place to more or less make those protections occur.
So after doing this case study with ODOT, have they made any changes to their organizational system for dealing with homeless issues, or do they have a contact person or somebody who does that full time or as part of their position or job?
We're not aware of ODOT making any changes like that. I am aware of them saying that if there were a separate outside agency that they could call, and they would direct them to who might come and help remove the people in terms of a social service agency, that they would be willing to consider that.
Okay, thank you again for your presentation, and good luck on finals. Have a good spring break, and the spring quarter seminar series starts again in 2 weeks, so see you then. Thank you, Dr. Tremoulet.
Thank you.